Up among the charming hills of Litchfield County in the town of Torrington, there stands a small and somewhat unpretentious house, which relies for its fame on the fact that on the 9th of May, 1800, into its hospitable arms there was born a lusty boy who was destined to become a dreamer of great dreams. Brown was his father's name, and the boy was called John. For over 130 years, the most famous house in town, the home of John Brown's birth, sat upon a hill in the west side of Torrington. The image of the house is familiar to many, but no one alive today ever even saw the house, leaving many curious about the property and what went on behind that famous facade. What was it like inside? Who were the people that lived and worked there? What other stories are unknown about the Brown family and their connection to Torrington? The homestead and property have a history as interesting as the famous abolitionists that once lived there. More than 50 years before the home was built, the property was known simply as Lot 14, a parcel of 52 3/4 acres owned by the town of Windsor and granted through a lottery system to Josiah Gaylord of Windsor, the first individual property owner. Land at the time was often bought and sold quickly, sight unseen, and it isn't clear if Josiah ever even came to the property. He passed the land on to his brother Elijah 15 years later, and Elijah quickly sold the land to Joel Loomis. Loomis is the first owner that we know lived on the property. He apparently was pleased with the location as he purchased an additional 11 acres, built a house and farm, and raised 4 children on the site. Although several early accounts attempt to date the Loomis house to 1776 and to identify it as the birthplace of John Brown, this was most likely a romanticized effort to link the home to the date of the country's independence rather than fact. Through the land records, it is clear that John and Elizabeth Morehouse, the daughter and son-in-law of Joe Loomis, inherited 8 acres of land upon Loomis's death, built a home on the property somewhere between 1785 and 1789, and sold it 4 years later to David Williams. 10 years after this, the home passed into the ownership of the Brown family when Owen Brown, John's father, purchased the Saltbox home that we are familiar with. The Saltbox home was one of the most prevalent styles built in New England in the 17th and 18th centuries and was ideally suited to the region's ever-changing weather, with a sharp-pitched roof deflecting strong winds and resisting the accumulation of heavy snow. Most homes of this style consisted of 1.5 stories, a central chimney, and a partial or full lean-to rear addition. The Saltbox got its name as the shape of the home, with its steep roofline, made it similar in appearance to the wood containers that held salt during the colonial period. The house was a modest one of just over 1,200 square feet, considered in its day a very comfortable and good class of dwelling. The first floor had 4 rooms and a front entryway. A living area spanned the left side of the house, while a dining room was to the right. A kitchen and pantry were in the rear, and a woodshed in the lean-to addition. Large fireplaces were located in the kitchen, living room, and dining room. There are accounts that John Brown was born in the southwest room on the first floor, indicated here by the star. On the second floor were 3 bedrooms and an unfinished area. The rooms in the back were under the eaves of the sloped roof. Although this saltbox would have been appealing to accommodate the growing Brown family, Owen was most likely attracted to the brook that ran through the property. A tanner by trade, the water was critical to the operation of his tannery business. Owen rented a sleigh from his new West Torrington neighbor and store owner Rebecca Hodges in 1799 and made several trips to move his wife, young daughter, and their belongings from Norfolk to the homestead. He built a workshop and dug his tanning pits near the stream seen on the left side of this map. Owen's background is an interesting one. He was born in 1771 in Simsbury, Connecticut, an area now part of the town of Canton. Believed to be a Mayflower descendant, his puritanical roots were evident in his sparse manners and devout religious beliefs. He was described by his friends as being keen, studious, and a great reader, beloved for his kindness and purity of heart, but not someone to joke with. Owen's views towards anti-slavery were ingrained at a young age. However, his stance was cemented when he was living in Norfolk, Connecticut, and personally witnessed a Southern slave owner attempting to break up a slave family by removing the father from his wife and children. Owen found this heartless behavior appalling and in direct opposition to his Christian upbringing. He declared himself an abolitionist from that time forward. Owen's passionate beliefs were to play a significant part in shaping his famous son. A year after the Browns moved to Torrington, their son John Brown was born. Owen made little fuss over his birth, stating, "In 1800 May 9th, John was born, 100 years after his great-grandfather, nothing else very uncommon." Although uncommon was not a word used to describe the later years of John Brown's life, his early childhood was typical of many children at the time. John recalled memories from his younger years fondly, playing in the wilderness, finding birds, squirrels, and turkey nests, and getting in snowball fights. He attended school but preferred to work in the tannery alongside his father. John was baptized at the First Congregational Church on Hodges Hill in West Torrington, where his family were members. When he was 5, his father joined the Great Westward Migration, sold his house in Torrington to his friend and neighbor William Whiting, and moved his family to Ohio. Once in Ohio, John Brown continued to be influenced by his father's strong feelings about religion and hatred of slavery, even returning east in his teens to study at the Morris Academy, convinced he should become a minister. However, John suffered with problems with his eyesight and returned home to Ohio at age 19. He soon after married and began raising a family. His father Owen returned to Torrington during this time to see his good friend William Whiting, who had purchased the homestead. He despaired that one of his sons was a little wild, but that John was a son of consolation, showing the strong regard that Owen had for his eldest son as John entered his 20s. Throughout his 20s and 30s, John Brown struggled to find an occupation that suited him and sufficiently supported his family. He tried and failed at several, from tanner, surveyor, postmaster, shepherd, and wool merchant. John remarried after the death of his first wife and fathered 20 children in total. However, only 7 survived to adulthood, 9 dying before reaching the age of 10. While John worked to support his family, his childhood home in Torrington passed through several generations of the Whiting family, who over 40 years of ownership increased the size of the property to approximately 115 acres. John returned to Torrington more than 20 times during these years, often visiting the Whitings near his old home. When he was 38, he returned to sell some oxen and purchase sheep in Torrington, Berkshire County, Massachusetts. Frederick Whiting recalled John voicing his concerns over the slavery situation and said he was possessed by the idea that some Moses will deliver the Africans, as did the former Moses the Egyptians. 2 years later, John returned to Torrington again, and he stopped by the Taylor Inn, located on the corner of East Main and Main Street. Innkeeper Captain Uri Taylor met with Brown that day, and the two argued quite passionately, with Taylor voicing his support for slavery and John Brown clearly against it. It is said that Taylor told Brown, "If you go on this way, you will end your days on the gallows." Of course, this was to come true 19 years later in 1859 when John Brown was hanged in Virginia after leading a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The omniscient prediction uttered by Torrington innkeeper Uri Taylor was made reality on December 2, 1859. With the news of John Brown's fate, his birthplace became the place of pilgrimage for those wishing to pay tribute to the famous abolitionist. The first to visit was Sarah Pritchard. Sarah was a 29-year-old from Waterbury who followed John Brown's activities and believed passionately in his cause. When she heard of his scheduled execution, she knew exactly what she had to do. On the morning of December 2, 1859, she traveled to Torrington, determined to spend the moment of his death at his birthplace. Prior to that, the home had passed from the Whitings to the Buells to the Cook family, who were then leasing the home to a tenant family. When Sarah Pritchard arrived at the homestead and explained her wish to be at the house at the time of John Brown's death, the tenants living there had never heard of John Brown, but let her into the home and offered her the opportunity to purchase any of the items in the house as a memento. Sarah recognized the residents didn't have the right to make the offer, but couldn't resist asking if she could purchase the latch to the southwest corner room, knowing that was where John was born. She recalled years later that the day was a beautiful summer and winter day, with a slight snow over the hills, and that she spent the hour of his martyrdom sitting by the window in the eastern gable of the garret, looking upon the hills whence the soul of the Torrington lad had perhaps caught its inspiration towards liberty for all races and peoples. Although Sarah Pritchard was the first pilgrim who visited the home, she wasn't the last. The notoriety of John Brown and the news of his death brought visitors by foot, bike, and carriage. In 1894, this group of young men and boys from the local YMCA came on a sightseeing tour to view the house and have lunch on the grounds. Many of the visitors who came to the homestead searched the house and property for items of interest they could display in their own homes as artifacts or refurbish into usable items. Beams were transformed into canes, floorboards into rulers, and fireplace bricks and house shingles were painted with images of the homestead and sold in various shops in town. Severe damage was caused when an ambitious visitor attempted to remove a stone embedded in the chimney bearing the date of the home's construction. Although the Cooks attempted to keep the house rented and maintained, tenants frequently moved and the house was often empty. The last family to live in the homestead was African American, but little is known of their identity, or even if they knew that the famous abolitionist was born here. This image from the late 1800s to early 1900s shows a family who lived in the home and may very well have been the last to reside there. The 100th year anniversary of John Brown's birth was celebrated as a small group gathered in the southeast room of the unoccupied homestead. William Cook, from the second generation of Cooks to own the home, addressed the house itself. "Old house, it is our wish today that you may be of use in the future as you have been in the past. We feel you are entitled to some consideration on our part, and we will try to preserve you for 100 years more." Local sentiment was finally focused on trying to preserve and protect the home as a historic structure. Two men who took part in the celebration, Dwight Kilbourne, clerk of the Superior Court of Litchfield, and Thomas Richards, pastor of the First Congregational Church where John Brown was baptized, were to take leading roles in the preservation efforts. Their dream was to raise sufficient funds to purchase the home and form an association that would restore and operate the property as a historic site. Although Kilbourne and Richards worked tirelessly towards this objective, donations received were not enough to purchase the property. It took a philanthropic Norfolk, Connecticut couple, Carl and Ellen Steckel, to move the dream of the two men forward. The Steckels heard of the plight of the homestead and purchased the property for $1,000 from the Cook estate in May of 1901. 2 weeks later, the John Brown Association was officially established with influential leaders and statewide dignitaries signing the Articles of Association. With the association formally recognized, the Steckels transferred the property to the newly formed organization. The home now officially transitioned from a private dwelling to one of the earliest examples in Connecticut of a historic site restoration and management project. And now that the association owned the building, restoration work could begin in earnest. Approximately $1,000 or more than $30,000 today was spent during the first few years of the association's existence to bring the building back to life. The Victorian 2/2 windows that had been put in place in the 1890s were replaced by 12/8s to match the home's original windows. New doors and siding replaced the old, and the crumbling chimney was repaired. Work was also performed to the interior. The association had long been searching for a caretaker for the property, and in 1903, Pastor Richards found the perfect candidate, Albert Knight. Knight came to Torrington from Germany with his parents in 1883 when he was 15 years old, and he began working at the Coe Brass Company. After accepting the caretaker position, it was agreed that the brass company would keep Knight on as an employee with full wages, even though he was to work full-time caring for the Birthplace, another example of a generous benefactor coming to the aid of the homestead. The Knights managed a small farm on site, and if Albert's schedule allowed, he was to show visitors the house and grounds. During Knight's time as caretaker between 1903 and 1913, hundreds of people from across the United States and several foreign countries came to the home, one of the first house museums in Connecticut. Knight's grandson Edward said years later that his grandfather was a born docent who thoroughly enjoyed giving his tour. On the afternoon of June 19, 1918, a fire broke out at the homestead when soot in the chimney caught fire. Although the wife of the caretaker at the time noticed the fire, she mistakenly believed it was extinguished. However, flames had already licked their way out of the chimney hole and set fire to the woodwork between the ceiling and the chimney, and continued to burn unnoticed until it was too late. The house burned to the ground, leaving only the chimney standing. The days of the John Brown Birthplace, serving as a house museum, came to an untimely end. Today, the land where the house stood is a historic property and it continues to evolve with the times. As of 1997, it has been part of the Connecticut Freedom Trail and is one of over 130 sites associated with the African American fight for freedom and social equity. After a merger with the John Brown Association in 2000, the property is now managed by the Torrington Historical Society as a historical landmark with a hiking trail and interpretive signage. Plans are in place for additional signage along the trail with quotes commemorating John Brown. An archaeological survey conducted on the property in 2002 identified artifacts from the Native American era to earthenware, farming, and personal items from the time of John Brown's family and later owners. The property is protected as a Connecticut Archaeological Preserve. And although the small and somewhat unpretentious house is no longer upon the hill, the property once known as Lot 14 remains a historical landmark, an educational resource, a place of peaceful contemplation, and destination for those wishing to pay homage to the boy that was born here, who was destined to become a dreamer of great dreams to end slavery in America and achieve freedom and equality for all.